I work night shifts in the pediatric wing of a mid-sized hospital. And from the first week, I noticed something that didn't match the calm routine we usually follow. The children sleep early, the lights stay dim, and the monitors create a steady background noise that becomes predictable after a few hours. Every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., a child starts crying somewhere at the far end of the corridor, and the sound is clear enough that it cuts through everything else. I walk toward it every time, checking each room one by one, and every door I open reveals the same thing: sleeping patients and steady monitors. The crying continues while I search, staying ahead of me as if it is always just beyond the next door. When I reach the final room, the sound stops completely, and there is no one inside except unused equipment and an empty bed. I reported it during a shift handover, and the senior nurse told me it was probably ventilation noise echoing through the hall. The next night, it happened again at the exact same time, with the same pattern and the same empty room at the end. On the third night, I stayed at the nurse's station when the crying started, and it was still loud enough to hear clearly from where I was sitting. I walked slower that time, paying attention to every detail, but the result didn't change. The sound stopped only when I reached the last door. I started checking patient logs to make sure no child had been moved or discharged without updates. And everything matched perfectly, with no inconsistencies. The crying began to include words after a week, and I heard a child say, "Mom, don't leave me," in a strained, tired voice. That detail made it impossible to ignore, because it sounded like a real child calling for help, and not random noise. I recorded the hallway one night using my phone, placing it on a cart near the middle of the corridor while I stayed still. When I replayed the recording later, the crying was clear, and the words were even sharper than I remembered. I brought the recording to a supervisor, and she told me the building was old and carried sound in strange ways, then asked me not to disturb other staff with it. I stopped mentioning it, but I didn't stop hearing it, and each night it became slightly louder and more specific. One night, the child used a name that made me freeze in place, because it was the name my mother used when I was very young. I hadn't heard that name in years, and no one at work knew it because I never used it professionally. The voice repeated it slowly, followed by the same sentence asking not to be left alone. I went directly to the last room without checking the others, and again, it was empty with the same unused equipment. I checked the hallway layout and realized there was a sealed section beyond that room, hidden behind a wall that looked permanent. I asked an older staff member about renovations, and she mentioned an old wing that had been closed years ago after structural issues. That night, I stayed longer after my shift ended, waiting until the hallway was completely quiet and the lights were lowered further. At 2:17, even off duty, the crying started again, and it came from the same direction. I pushed the cart aside and examined the wall at the end, noticing a faint outline of what used to be a door. I found a maintenance panel nearby and forced it open, revealing a narrow access path behind the wall. I stepped inside with my phone light on, following the sound that was now directly ahead of me and no longer distant. The narrow path led into a forgotten corridor that was colder and filled with old equipment pushed against the walls, and the crying echoed clearly from deeper inside. I moved slowly, stepping around broken carts and stacked supplies, and the voice continued repeating the same sentence with my childhood name. At the end of the corridor, I found a small room with a rusted sign, and the door was slightly open despite everything around it being sealed. Inside the room, there was a single bed, old monitoring devices, and a chair placed close to the bedside, as if someone had been sitting there for hours. The crying stopped the moment I stepped inside, and the silence was heavier than anything I had heard before. I searched the room carefully, opening cabinets and checking behind equipment, but there was no child present. On the desk near the bed, I found a file covered in dust, and it contained records of a pediatric patient who had been admitted decades ago. The name in the file matched the name my mother used for me when I was a child, spelled the same way and written repeatedly in the notes. The file described a girl left alone for extended periods during treatment, with repeated notes about distress and calling for her mother. The dates in the file matched a period when my mother had worked in this hospital before she disappeared from my life. I kept reading, and the notes mentioned that the child's condition worsened after being left unattended during a night shift. The final entry stated that the patient was found unresponsive in the same room after hours without supervision. I looked around the room again, focusing on the chair, and noticed indentations in the cushion as if someone had been sitting there recently. The crying started again, but this time it came from directly behind me, inside the same room. I turned quickly and saw nothing, but the sound was now close enough that it felt like it was coming from the bed itself. I stepped closer and placed my hand on the mattress, which was colder than the surrounding air and slightly damp. The voice repeated the same sentence, but slower, and then it added, "You didn't come back." I dropped the file and backed away, hitting the chair, which moved slightly as if someone else had pushed it from the other side. I ran out of the room and back through the corridor, but the crying followed me all the way to the entrance. When I reached the main hallway, the sound stopped immediately, and everything returned to normal as if nothing had happened. I reported sick the next day and didn't return to that shift for weeks. But the recordings I had kept didn't change and still contained the same voice. I visited my mother's old records and confirmed she had worked night shifts in that same ward during the time mentioned in the file. The dates aligned perfectly with the timeline of the child's admission, and death. When I confronted a retired staff member who had known her, she admitted that my mother had been responsible for that patient during a critical night and had left the room unattended for too long. She said my mother never recovered from what happened and disappeared shortly after without explanation. I returned to the hospital one last time, walked to the end of the corridor, and stood in front of the sealed wall at 2:17 a.m. The crying started again, and this time I didn't move, and I didn't search, and I didn't respond. The voice called my childhood name repeatedly, followed by the same sentence. And then it stopped abruptly after several minutes. I left the hospital that night and never went back to that wing again. But the recordings remain unchanged and still play the same voice every time. The file I took from that room is still with me, and the name written inside it never changes, no matter how many times I look at it. I know exactly what happened in that room, and I know exactly why that voice keeps calling. And it is not something that will ever stop on its own. One last question. If you were in her place at that moment, would you have done the same? Be honest. What does her choice deserve out of 10? Subscribe now. The best story is coming next.